Some neighborhoods look peaceful from the outside. White fences, neatly mowed lawns, friendly smiles at the mailbox. But beneath that suburban calm, sometimes trouble brews quietly, waiting for the right moment to boil over. That's exactly what happened when my uncle, a retired Marine Corps veteran with a limp in his left leg, bought his dream home in a quiet cul-de-sac last spring. He just wanted a fresh start, a peaceful place to work on restoring old motorcycles. But peace, it turns out, wasn't part of the HOA's plan, especially not for Karen, the self-appointed queen of the neighborhood board. She didn't like the look of his pickup truck. She didn't like the veteran's flag he hung from the porch. She didn't like him. And it didn't take long before she made it her mission to make sure he knew it. The first letter showed up 3 days after he moved in, a warning about unsightly decor because of flag. Then came complaints about the truck being too large for community aesthetics. My uncle tried to shrug it off, tried to be the bigger man. But it wasn't long before the notes turned into confrontations. Karen standing in his driveway, finger pointing, voice shrill enough to draw curtains aside up and down the street. My uncle never raised his voice back. He just stood there, stiff calm, letting her words wash over him like rain. But little did she know, there was another Marine watching from just a few doors down, a colonel who wasn't the type to let disrespect slide. Let us know in the comments where you're watching from, and whether you think he would have stayed silent or stepped in like he did. The first real blow came on a Saturday morning, the kind of bright, warm day that made you think nothing bad could happen. My uncle was out front, carefully installing a custom ramp leading up to his porch, a project he'd been planning for weeks to make life easier on his bad leg. He worked slow, steady, measuring twice, cutting once. A few neighbors nodded as they passed by, polite but distant, and for a moment it seemed like things might finally settle down. But then Karen appeared. She marched down the sidewalk like she owned the street, her little clipboard in hand, her mouth already forming words before she even reached his yard. "This isn't ADA compliant," she snapped, pointing at the half-finished ramp like it was some kind of threat to public safety. "You're creating a hazard. I'll have to report you to the HOA." My uncle wiped the sweat from his brow and calmly explained that the ramp was temporary, just to make access easier until a contractor could finish the official install. But Karen wasn't listening. She wasn't here to understand. She was here to make a scene. Within minutes, she had her phone out, snapping pictures like a tabloid photographer, muttering loudly about violations and community standards. My uncle, God bless him, just kept working, head down, shoulders squared, even as a few curious neighbors began to peek over their fences to watch. It should have ended there, with her huffing back to her house, empty threats swirling in the hot air. But that afternoon, an official notice showed up taped to his door, a demand for immediate removal of the unauthorized structure or face a daily fine. Karen wasn't just bluffing. She was declaring war. The notice was bad enough, but what really hit my uncle wasn't the fine. It was a message it sent. He wasn't welcome. Not here. Not by her. And by the look of the neighbors who now crossed the street instead of waving hello. Maybe not by anyone. Still, he refused to be rattled. He pulled down the temporary ramp, boxed up his tools, and made a quiet call to a local contractor, determined to do everything by the book. If Karen wanted to fight, she'd have to work harder for it. But Karen wasn't about to let it go. That week, a steady drip of small aggression started. Mysterious, anonymous complaints about his lawn being half an inch too tall. Tickets left on his windshield for parking violations that didn't exist. Petty things, tiny paper cuts, each one designed to bleed him just a little more. And through it all, my uncle stayed calm. Not once did he lose his temper. Not once did he raise his voice. It was like watching a stone endure the beating of a river. Quiet, unmoving. But the Marine colonel down the street, a man built like a mountain and quiet as a storm before it breaks, had been watching everything. He saw the way Karen cornered my uncle at the mailbox, heard her snide comments about bringing down property values. And one afternoon, as Karen squared up in the driveway once again, her voice shrill and cutting through the sticky summer air, the colonel finally moved. No words, no warnings, just a heavy thud of boots across the pavement as he crossed his yard, hands tucked behind his back, his face unreadable. My uncle straightened up, and for the first time, Karen hesitated. Karen's mouth kept moving, but the words seemed to falter as the colonel drew closer. You could almost feel the air shift, thick with something heavier than anger, authority, maybe, or just the unmistakable presence of someone who'd seen real battles and was impressed by petty ones. He stopped at the edge of my uncle's driveway, standing tall, his shadow stretching long across the concrete. He didn't say a thing. Didn't have to. His mere presence seemed to silence the entire street. Karen, still clutching her clipboard like a shield, tried to recover, adjusting her posture, smoothing her hair. "Can I help you?" she barked, her voice thinner now, higher at the edges. The colonel just stared at her, steady, unblinking, like he was reading every selfish motive right off her face. My uncle, for the first time in weeks, allowed himself the ghost of a smile. Karen shifted on her feet, darting glances around like she expected backup, but none came. The neighbors were out, sure, but they weren't rallying to her side this time. They watched in wary silence from behind half-closed blinds and cracked-open doors. Seconds ticked by, long, heavy seconds, before Karen finally dropped her eyes. "This is a private matter," she mumbled, backing a step away. Still, the colonel said nothing. He simply remained where he was, arms loosely folded behind him, a silent wall between Karen and my uncle. And just like that, without a single raised voice, without a single threat, Karen turned on her heel and stomped back to her house. Her retreat wasn't fast. It was a slow, seething kind, the kind you only see when a bully realizes they're not the biggest one in the room anymore. You might think that would be the end of it, that after being stared down and shamed in her own neighborhood, Karen would back off. But bullies like her, they don't go quietly. That same evening, long after the sun dipped behind the trees and the streetlights buzzed to life, my uncle found a fresh notice taped to his front door. This one wasn't from the HOA. It was handwritten, sloppy, angry, a scrawl of threats about being watched, about how violators aren't welcome here, signed only with a single childish word: concerned. My uncle stood there for a long moment, reading it under the porch light, his jaw working like he was grinding down every ounce of rage inside him. He folded the letter once, then again, slow, methodical, and tucked it into a drawer in the kitchen without a word. No police call. No complaints. He wasn't going to give her that satisfaction. But the colonel, he had a different idea of justice. The next morning, a flag appeared on the colonel's lawn. Not just any flag. The Marine Corps colors, bold and snapping sharp in the breeze. And then another flag went up on the house across the street. An army banner, clean and proud. And another. And another. By the end of the week, almost every veteran on the block, some my uncle hadn't even met yet, had hoisted their own flags high. The street transformed into a sea of red, white, blue, and every shade of defiance in between. Karen's house sat in the middle of it all, conspicuously bare, watching, seething, losing. My uncle didn't say much about it, just stood on his porch every evening after work, hand resting lightly on his cane, watching the flags flutter like an unspoken promise. You're not alone. Karen didn't take the message well. Not that anyone expected her to. For the next few days, she doubled down, filing noise complaints every time someone so much as hammered a nail or ran a lawnmower. She called in bogus parking violations against anyone who dared park too close to her curb. She even tried to demand that the HOA create a new rule banning unauthorized flag displays, a move that was met with a deafening, almost comical silence at the next board meeting. But the more she pushed, the more the neighborhood quietly, stubbornly, pushed back. Yard work that had once been solitary turned communal. Neighbors my uncle had never spoken to before started stopping by, offering a hand with yard projects or dropping off casseroles, just because. Every small kindness added a new stone to the wall forming between Karen and the rest of the street. And the colonel? He kept his distance. He never spoke publicly about Karen, never bragged about standing up to her. But he was always there, a silent sentinel, trimming hedges, walking his dog, or just standing on his porch when Karen dared to raise her voice at someone. It didn't matter that he said nothing. His presence said everything. One evening, As my uncle was watering the rose bushes he'd planted out front, the colonel stopped by, didn't ask permission, just picked up a second hose from the side of the house and began watering the other side of the yard. They didn't talk much, didn't have to, but when they finished, my uncle clapped the colonel lightly on the back, his voice rough with emotion. "Semper Fi," he muttered. The colonel just nodded once, a small smile cracking the edges of his usual steel expression, before walking back down the driveway. As summer deepened and the cicadas sang loud in the trees, my uncle started laying the groundwork for something bigger. Something Karen couldn't touch, no matter how many complaints she filed. He reached out to a local veterans organization, quietly, humbly, asking if they'd be interested in hosting a community barbecue. Nothing fancy, just good food, good company, and a way for neighbors to meet the men and women who had served. To his surprise, they jumped at the idea. Within days, flyers appeared around the neighborhood, hand-delivered, not posted on public boards that Karen could tear down. Veterans Appreciation Cookout. All are welcome. No HOA approval needed. It wasn't official business, just neighbors being neighbors. The colonel volunteered to organize the security. Not that anyone expected trouble, but sent a quiet message. This time, they were ready, and word spread fast. People who'd once stayed silent began stepping forward. The retired Navy chief from 2 blocks over, the Army medic with the 3-legged dog. Even families who had no military ties came out to offer tables, chairs, grills. It was like the whole street had been holding its breath for months, waiting for someone to show them it was okay to push back against a petty tyranny. Meanwhile, Karen watched from behind her curtain, furious, trapped, realizing too late that every move she made had only drawn people closer together. My uncle didn't care about sticking it to her. That wasn't his mission. He just wanted to live quietly. But if his quiet life meant standing a little taller, reaching a little further into the community around him, he'd do it gladly. And with every passing day, the invisible line around Karen's house grew thicker, a barrier she had built with her own hands. The day of the barbecue arrived with a sky so clear it felt like a blessing. Smokers fired up early, the smell of hickory and sweet corn curling down the street in warm, heavy waves. Flags fluttered proudly from almost every porch, and tables crowded with potato salad, baked beans, and racks of ribs lined the front yards. It wasn't a party, not exactly. It was something quieter, deeper, a gathering, a stand. Veterans and civilians alike shook hands, swapped stories, laughed in the late afternoon sun. Kids darted between lawn chairs waving miniature flags, their shouts carrying on the breeze. And in the middle of it all stood my uncle, weathered, steady, a soft smile on his face as neighbors he'd barely known a month ago clapped him on the back and pressed plates of food into his hands. The colonel kept a watchful eye from the sidelines, his dog lounging lazily at his feet, sunglasses masking whatever emotion flickered behind his calm expression. Karen? She stayed inside all day, her blinds drawn tight, her car conspicuously absent from the driveway. Some whispered that she had left town for the weekend to avoid facing the scene. Others thought she was still there, hiding, stewing in her own bitterness. Either way, it didn't matter. Her power had slipped away, not with a fight, but with laughter, kindness, and stubborn solidarity. As dusk fell and string lights blinked to life across porches and trees, my uncle stood with a plate of ribs balanced in one hand, chatting easily with neighbors he now called friends. No speeches, no grand gestures, just the quiet, undeniable victory of a man who had been pushed and had stood his ground, surrounded now by a family he never expected to find. In the weeks that followed, the neighborhood settled into a new rhythm, one that didn't leave space for Karen's games anymore. People wave when they pass each other now. They stopped to chat about lawn tips, weekend plans, even swapped old war stories over evening beers on front porches. And my uncle? He moved through it all quietly, gratefully, like a man who had fought a private battle and won something even bigger than he'd set out to protect. Karen, for her part, tried once or twice to claw her way back into relevance. She sent a letter to the HOA demanding fines for unauthorized gatherings. She filed a complaint about excessive flag displays cluttering up the view, but nobody bit. The HOA board, maybe embarrassed, maybe just exhausted, politely brushed her off, citing community spirit and the right to display personal property. The letters stopped after that. Word spread that Karen had listed her house for sale, though the sign never officially went up. Some said she couldn't take the isolation. Some said she simply couldn't stand living in a place where no one feared her anymore. Either way, she wasn't seen much after the barbecue. And when a moving van finally pulled up one misty morning in late September, barely anyone noticed or cared. My uncle watched from his porch, sipping coffee, the Marine Corps flag still snapping proudly above him. He didn't gloat. He didn't need to. Sometimes the best revenge isn't fire and fury. It's outlasting the storm, standing a little taller, and letting the small-minded folks shrink under the weight of their own bitterness. And when the truck pulled away and the street grew still again, he simply smiled to himself and went back to sanding the frame of an old Harley in the garage. Life didn't suddenly become perfect after Karen left, but it became real, authentic. Neighbors lingered a little longer at the mailbox. Kids rode their bikes in loose packs, waving at every porch they passed. Barbecue invitations turned into monthly potlucks. Quiet kindness became the heartbeat of the street, steady and unspoken. My uncle never became the loudest voice in the room. That was never his way. But he didn't have to. His presence alone, his stubborn patience and quiet resilience, had changed the block in a way that no HOA rule ever could. The Marine colonel still walked his dog every evening, tipping his cap at every flag he passed, a silent acknowledgement between warriors who understood the real weight of standing up without needing to shout about it. Sometimes my uncle would wave him over, share a coffee or a beer, and the two would sit in companionable silence, swapping stories only when the spirit moved them. One night, as they sat watching the stars blink awake over the rooftops, the colonel spoke. Just once. His voice was low, rough, meant only for my uncle's ears. "You handled her better than a whole battalion would have," he said, a ghost of a smile flickering under his weathered features. My uncle chuckled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Didn't do much," he muttered, but they both knew that wasn't true. Sometimes doing not much, refusing to lower yourself, refusing to break, was the hardest thing in the world. And somehow, through quiet strength, a man who wanted nothing more than peace had helped build a stronger, tighter, better neighborhood. One quiet act of defiance at a time. No battles, no speeches, just standing tall and letting the flags do the talking.